She walked into that dinner as a wife who believed silence meant respect, and walked out as a woman who unknowingly ended her marriage in front of a family she didn't yet understand. No one raised their voice, no one showed their true face, but in that room, something far more dangerous than conflict happened, because her husband wasn't the most powerful man at the table, and neither was she prepared for the truth sitting quietly across from her, her father-in-law, a man the world never questioned, because the world never had to face him directly. What she thought was rejection was actually the first move in a much larger game she never knew she was already inside. And by the time she realized what was happening, there was no way to leave unchanged. This story is not about crime. It is about power that never needs to shout, and truth that only appears when it's already too late to ignore. This channel explores mafia boss stories where some people are born to dominate, and some lessons are never taught in classrooms, only understood in the shadow of real power. We don't tell crime stories. We reveal mindset, strength, and the hidden rules behind true authority. The real lesson in this story is simple. Sometimes the moment you think you're being ignored is the moment you're being measured. If this story made you think differently about power, silence, and control, don't forget to like, comment where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories that reveal what most people never see.
I still remember the way the table looked that night. Not because it was beautiful, but because it was perfect, in the way expensive things always are quiet, controlled, and slightly cold, like nobody there had ever needed anything from anyone else. The dining room at the Hale estate was long enough to make conversation feel like it had to travel before it was allowed to matter. Crystal glasses, polished silver, food I couldn't pronounce without feeling I did belong in the same sentence as it. I sat on Richard's right side, my husband. Or at least that was the legal definition. He didn't look at me when he spoke. Not really. He looked past me, over me, like I was part of the seating arrangement rather than the conversation. His father sat at the head of the table, Victor Hale. A man who didn't raise his voice, didn't gesture much, didn't need to. When he entered a room, it didn't feel like attention shifted toward him. It felt like attention stopped moving altogether. That night, he said maybe 12 sentences total. I remember because I counted them. I always count things when I feel out of place. It helps me stay grounded. It sets a habit from surgery: observe, categorize, detach emotion from process. But there was nothing clinical about this room. It was social, which made it worse. Because in surgery, if you re-invisible, it means you redoing everything right. At that table, being invisible meant something else entirely. Richard was talking about a new investment portfolio, healthcare infrastructure, private-public partnerships, words that sounded clean but carried weight I couldn't quite measure. His uncle laughed at something I didn't understand. His cousin leaned forward, interested in details that didn't seem important but clearly were. And I sat there, smiling when appropriate, nodding when expected, speaking only when spoken to. Not once did anyone ask me a question that required more than a polite answer. Not once did anyone pause like my thoughts might matter beyond decoration. At some point, I realized something strange. It was that they were ignoring me. It was worse. They had already decided what I was. Not a guest, not family, not even an outsider. Something in between. Something tolerated. Something placed. Richard finally turned to me, at one point, halfway through dessert. "You've been quiet tonight," he said. Not a question, a correction. I smiled slightly. The kind of smile you learn in hospitals when you don't want to a situation. "Just tired," I said. He nodded, satisfied with the answer, and turned back to his conversation like I had successfully returned to my assigned role. That was the moment I noticed his father watching me, not staring, not glaring, observing, like a man review a system for failure points. Victor Hale had pale hands that never fidgeted, a glass of water untouched in front of him, a posture that suggested he had never once had to rush for anything in his life. When our eyes met, it lasted maybe 2 seconds. But something in it felt intentional, not curiosity, assessment, and then it was gone. He looked away as if I had already been evaluated and filed somewhere internally. I remember thinking, almost absently, that I had spent my entire life being examined by people: professors, surgeons, senior physicians, boards, committees. But this felt different, like I wasn't being judged for competence, I was being measured for usefulness. After dinner, Richard excused himself early. Work call, something urgent. He kissed my cheek on the way out, mechanical routine, already halfway gone before his lips even touched my skin. "I'll see you at home," he said. Not we, just him. The room felt quieter after he left, but not emptier. It was already empty in a way that had nothing to do with physical presence. Victor remained seated. So did I. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The others filtered out slowly, conversations trailing behind them like loose threads. Until eventually it was just him and me at opposite ends of a table designed oppositely for many more voices than were currently willing to exist in it. He finally spoke without looking up. "You were not comfortable here." It wasn't phrased like empathy. It was to even an observation. It was a fact he had already confirmed and was simply choosing to state aloud. I hesitated. In my world, honesty is usually safer than evasion. "I'm adjusting," I said. That made him look at me. Directly this time. And, for the first time all night, I felt something like pressure in the air between us, not emotional, not hostile, just precise. Like standing too close to a machine that understands how to break things cleanly. "Adjustment implies you intend to stay," he said. I didn't answer immediately, because something about the question felt off. Not rude, not invasive, just structurally important in a way I didn't yet understand. "I'm married to your son," Sus said carefully. A pause. Then he nodded once, slowly, as if I had confirmed something he already suspected. "Yes," he said. "You are." And then he stood. That was it. No goodbye, no dismissal, no continuation, just conclusion. As he left the room, I remember watching him walk away and thinking something I didn't fully understand yet. Not that he was powerful. I already knew that. Wealth makes power visible in predictable ways. No, what unsettled me was something else: the absence of performance. Most wealthy people perform their influence. Even quietly, even subtly. They signal. They imply. They hint at control. Victor didn't. He didn't need to signal anything. Which meant whatever he controlled didn't require acknowledgement to function. I stayed at the table long after the staff cleared the dishes. Eventually, I stood and walked through the long hallway alone. My heels made almost no sound on the polished floor, which somehow made it worse, like even my presence was being absorbed before it could register. When I got into the car that would take me home, Richard was already there waiting, looking at his phone, not looking at me. "You okay?" he asked without lifting his eyes. "Yes," I said, and I realized I was lying so naturally I almost believed it myself. The drive home was quiet. Boston lights blurred past the window like distant signals from another life. Richard eventually put his phone down and said, almost casually, "My father likes you." I turned slightly. "That's what that was?" I asked. He smiled faintly. "It's not something you need to analyze so deeply." I looked back out the window. Because I understood something in that moment, even if I didn't yet have the language for it. Some families don't invite you in. They observe you until they decide what category you belong to. And once decided, you stop being asked questions. We arrived home shortly after midnight. Richard went upstairs first. I stayed downstairs a few minutes longer, sitting in the silence of a house that felt more like architecture than warmth. And for reasons I couldn't explain at the time, I kept thinking about Victor Hale's eyes, not cold, not warm, just final in a way I wasn't used to people being. I told myself it was nothing, just an uncomfortable dinner, just a family I didn't quite fit into yet, just adjustment. But even as I said it internally, I already knew something was wrong with that explanation. Because deep down, I didn't feel like someone who didn't fit. I felt like someone who had been placed carefully into a space she was never meant to question. And that night, for the first time, I started to wonder something I immediately tried to avoid. What kind of family doesn't notice when you stop existing at the table because they never considered you part of it in the first place? I didn't decide to leave Richard Hale in a moment. There was no dramatic argument, no breaking point, no single sentence that shattered everything cleanly enough to point at later and say, that was it. It happened the way most endings actually happen in real life, quietly, incrementally, like something slowly losing pressure until one day you realize it is no longer holding anything together. The morning after that dinner, I woke up earlier than Richard. That was normal. We had never really synchronized our lives beyond logistics. Two schedules passing through the same space, occasionally intersecting, rarely touching. He was still asleep when I sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee I didn't taste. Boston out the window looked unchanged. That always confused me about life-altering moments. The world doesn't acknowledge them. It just continues behaving normally, as if nothing inside you has shifted at all. I remember opening my laptop, checking emails, responding to hospital cases, reviewing charts, normal things, professional things. Things that made me feel like I still existed in a system that made sense. But underneath all of it, there was something else running quietly in parallel, a thought I kept pushing away. Not about Richard, not even about the marriage itself, about the dinner, about Victor Hale's size. There was a specific science he carried. Not absence of speech, absence of need. People who don't need anything from you are always the hardest to interpret. Because you can negotiate with them. You can influence them. You can even clearly define what they want from you. And I hated not being able to define things. In surgery, uncertainty kills people. You learn quickly to eliminate it wherever possible. By the time Richard came downstairs, I had already convinced myself that I was overthinking. He kissed my forehead on his way to the coffee machine. You re-up early, he said. I didn't sleep much, I replied. He nodded, like that was an acceptable piece of data, then scrolled through his phone while drinking his coffee. No follow-up question, no curiosity, just acknowledgement without engagement. That should have told me something. But I was still operating under the assumption that emotional distance in marriage was a problem of compatibility, not structure, not design. I left for the hospital before him. The hospital always grounded me. The noise, the urgency, the clarity of physical systems breaking in ways that could be repaired. At least there, problems had definitions. A brain hemorrhage doesn't pretend to be something else. It is what it is. It either stops or it does tea. That day, I had two surgeries scheduled, both delicate, both time-sensitive, and for a few hours I was able to forget everything else. Another thing about high-pressure work. It gives you permission to postpone yourself. By mid-afternoon, I was in the neurosurgical recovery unit, reviewing post-op scans when Nora found me. She didn't knock on my office door. She rarely did. She leaned against the frame instead, holding a tablet. You quiet today, she said. I always am, I replied without looking up. That's not true, she said. You were usually quiet but focused. This is different. I finally looked at her. Nora Bennett had that kind of presence that made people underestimate her at first. She didn't demand attention. She simply held it when she spoke. I am fine, I said automatically. She tilted her head slightly, unconvinced. What people say right before they either quit their job or move to another country, she said. A pause. Then she added, more gently, which one are you doing? I almost smiled. Almost. Neither answer felt accurate, so I chose the safest version of the truth. I'm just tired, I said again. Nora didn't respond immediately. She just studied me in that way, she had, like she was reading something written underneath my words instead of the words themselves. Then she changed the subject, but not completely. You still living at the Hale place? She asked casually. Yes, I said. It felt strange saying it out loud. Like describing a location I didn't fully recognize anymore. She nodded once. Must be nice, she said. That level of money. I didn't answer that. Because I had stopped associating money with comfort a while ago. At some point, wealth stops feeling like freedom and starts feeling like infrastructure. Something large and stable and difficult to question without understanding how deeply you already inside it. That evening, I came home later than usual. Richard was already there, sitting at the dining table with papers spread out in front of him. He didn't look up when I walked in. Dinner is in the oven, he said. I paused in the doorway. I'm not hungry, I replied. That made him look up. Not surprised, just mildly adjusted. You should eat, he said. I will later, I said. A small silence followed, not uncomfortable, just empty. Then he returned to his documents, and I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, watching him. Not because I expected anything different, but because I suddenly noticed how little I knew about what he actually did when he wasn't being my husband. Not the job title, that I knew. The function, the purpose behind all the constant meetings, calls, travel, conversations that never included me. It struck me then how easy it had been to stop asking. I went upstairs, changed clothes, sat by the window, and for the first time, I thought seriously about the idea of leaving, not as rebellion, not as emotion, as a logistical decision, a structural correction, like removing a faulty component from a system before it causes damage elsewhere. The thought surprised me more than it should have, because I wasn't someone who made impulsive decisions in relationships. I analyzed, I weighed, I waited, but something about the dinner had shifted that internal process. It wasn't that I felt unwanted. It was that I felt unregistered, like my presence or absence would meaningfully change anything in that household's functioning, and that realization creates a very specific kind of clarity. The next morning, I contacted a lawyer, not dramatically, not emotionally, just a consultation request. I told myself it was precautionary, understanding options, gathering information. That's what professionals do before making decisions. They don't leap, they assess. The lawyer's office was in downtown Boston, clean and quiet in the way expensive legal spaces always are. He asked me standard questions: duration of marriage, assets, shared accounts, property structure. And then, halfway through the conversation, he paused. Your financial entanglement here is more than most divorces of this type, he said. Complex how? I asked. He adjusted his glasses slightly. It looks like there are multiple holding structures tied to healthcare investment portfolios, some offshore components, nothing illegal on the surface, but he stopped. But what? I pressed. He chose his words carefully. But it's not a simple marital separation. It's embedded in corporate layers, unusual ones. I remember nodding slowly, even though I didn't fully understand what that meant yet. On the way out, I kept replaying his words, embedded. That was the word that stayed with me. Not because it sounded threatening, but because it sounded intentional, like something designed to be difficult to extract. That night, Richard came home later than usual. He found me sitting in the living room with the divorce paperwork draft onto my lap. He didn't react immediately. That was the first sign something about this situation wasn't going to follow normal emotional patterns. Most people react to divorce papers. Even denial is a reaction. But Richard just looked at them for a moment, then looked at me. You re serious, he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. Yes, I said. He sat across from me, slowly, deliberately, like someone choosing posture over emotion. You making a mistake, he said. There was no anger in his voice. That was what made it unsettling. I expected anger. Anger is human, predictable, manageable. But there was none, just certainty. What kind of mistake? I asked. He studied me for a moment, then he said something I didn't understand at the time. You think you stepping out of something simple, he said. You not. A pause. Then he added quieter. You see the shape of it yet. I remember that line very clearly, because it sounded less like a warning and more like a statement of fact, like gravity. I closed the folder slowly. I've made my decision, I said. Richard didn't argue further. He just nodded once, almost thoughtfully. Then he stood up. I hope you understand what you're redoing, he said, and left the room. That was the moment I should have felt free. But I did tea. Instead, I felt something else. Like I had just moved one piece on a board without realizing I was still inside the game. I did think leaving a marriage would feel like silence. Not relief. Not chaos. Not even fear at first. Just silence. The kind that sits behind everything you do, like a second shadow you can quite step out of. Richard didn't argue after I told him I was filing for divorce. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't try to stop me. That should have felt like freedom. Instead, it felt like being released from something that hadn't fully admitted it was holding me in the first place. 2 days passed without any real change. No dramatic phone calls. No emotional breakdowns, no sudden apologies, just distance. He slept in the guest room. I stayed in ours. We moved through the house like two systems sharing the same infrastructure, but no longer exchanging data. It was during those days that I started noticing things I had previously filtered out. The way the house staff avoided eye contact longer than necessary. The way deliveries arrived without tracking information I could verify. The way certain rooms were always locked when I passed them, even though I had lived there for 2 years. Small things, individually meaningless, collectively unsettling. On the third day, Richard asked me to have dinner with him. Not at home, not at the house, at a restaurant downtown, a private reservation. No staff, no interruptions. I think we should talk properly, he said over the phone. His voice was calm, controlled. Like this was a business meeting he had already prepared for. I almost said no, but something in me wanted clarity more than avoidance, so I agreed. The restaurant was exactly what I expected from his world. Minimalist. Expensive in a way that didn't need to prove itself. Soft lighting that made everything look slightly more important than it actually was. Richard was already there when I arrived. He stood when I approached the table, a gesture of politeness that felt rehearsed rather than emotional. You came, he said. I said I would, I replied. We sat. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The waiter appeared, poured water, disappeared again. No unnecessary interaction. Everything efficient, controlled. Richard finally leaned back slightly in his chair. I don't think you understand what you're redoing, he said. I exhaled slowly. I understand enough, I replied. He nodded as if he expected that answer. Then he said something that shifted the atmosphere immediately. This is to just a divorce, Camila. I looked at him more directly now. It is for me, I said. He studied me for a moment, not emotionally, not pleading, assessing, like he was deciding how much to reveal. Then he said it again. You don't just leave this family. There it was, the same line, or something close to it. The same structure I had heard before, now repeated with more weight behind it. I leaned forward slightly. What does that even mean? I asked. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked down at his glass, turned it slightly with his fingers, and again his voice lowered. It means there are systems involved that don't respond well to sudden exits. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, because it sounded rehearsed. Systems, I repeated. Richard, are you talking about your family like it is a corporation? He looked at me then, and for the first time since I had known him, there was something in his expression that didn't to feel controlled. Not panic, not fear, pressure, like something above him had just shifted. You think I'm exaggerating, he said quietly. I think you were being vague, I replied, a pause. Then he said something that didn't match anything I had expected. My father does tea like uncertainty, he said. That sentence should have meant nothing. But the way he said it made my body register it before my mind could interpret it. Not emotional, not symbolic, structural. I leaned back slightly. Your father doesn't cis likes uncertainty, repeated. That is your explanation for why I can cis get a divorce. He didn't correct me, which, in hindsight, was the first real confirmation that something about this situation was not normal. Instead, he said, you didn't grow up around people like him. That sentence landed differently. Not as insult, not as judgment, as separation. As if he and I had been standing on the same ground until that moment, and now he was pointing out I had never actually been there at all. I studied him carefully. People like who, Richard? I asked. He hesitated, just briefly. Then he said, people who don't have to explain what they do to make things work. I felt something tighten in my chest, but I kept my voice steady. That does sound like a family issue, I said. That sounds like an accountability issue. He didn't respond to that. Instead, he leaned forward, slightly, lowering his voice further. I'm trying to help you understand something before you make a decision you can undo, he said. And that was when I realized something important. He wasn't trying to convince me to stay. He was trying to measure how far I had already gone. There is a difference. One is emotional. The other is strategic. I set my glass down slowly. Then explain it, I said clearly. No vague statements, no warnings, just facts. Richard looked at me for a long moment, then he exhaled once and said, do you remember the dinner at my father's house? I nodded, of course. He nodded as well. Did you notice anything unusual? The question irritated me slightly, because it assumed I had already been observing everything. I noticed I was ignored, I said. That S usually hard to miss. That made him pause. A faint expression crossed his face, not amusement, not approval. Something closer to resignation. You think that was personal, he said. What else would it be? I replied. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked down again, like choosing words carefully. Then, he said, it was about you. That sentence should have been comforting. But it was because it implied something far more uncomfortable. That I had not been the subject of attention at all, not even negative attention. Just irrelevant presence. I leaned in slightly. Then what was it about? I asked. Richard looked at me directly now, and for the first time that night, his voice lost its practiced neutrality. It was about whether you noticed, he said. A pause, then quieter, and what you would do if you did. I felt my focus sharpen. That's not normal family behavior, I said. No, he admitted. Silence stretched between us. The restaurant noise faded slightly in my awareness. Everything around us felt farther away than it should. I spoke slowly. Richard, I said, what exactly is your family involved in? He hesitated. For the first time, not like someone choosing phrasing, like someone deciding whether speaking at all was safe. Then he said, legally investments, healthcare infrastructure, private funding networks. I narrowed my eyes slightly. Legally, I repeated. He nodded once. But that's not what you re-asking, he added. I didn't respond. Because he was right. I was on to asking about paperwork. I was asking about behavior, about control, about why everything in that house felt like it was designed to be observed rather than lived in. Richard leaned back again, and when he spoke next, his voice was lower than before. My father builds systems, he said. Not corporations, not businesses, systems. And systems don't function well when parts of them leave without understanding how they reconnected. I studied him for a long moment. Then I asked the question I probably should have asked much earlier. Is that a threat? He shook his head immediately. No, he said. It's an explanation. That distinction mattered to him, I could tell. But it didn't clarify anything for me. It only made everything less defined. We left the restaurant shortly after. No resolution, no argument, no emotional collapse. Just unfinished conversation disguised as closure. In the car ride home, neither of us spoke. The city passed by quietly outside the window, indifferent to whatever threshold I had just crossed internally. When we arrived at the house, Richard got out first. Before going inside, he paused, not looking at me directly, just speaking into the space between us. If you go through with this, he said, you should understand something. I waited. He continued, my father doesn't react to decisions. He reacts to patterns. A pause. Then he added, almost like an afterthought, and you've already become one. He went inside. I stayed in the car for a moment longer, not because I was afraid, but because I was trying to understand what kind of world defines a person as a pattern, and why, suddenly, I had the uncomfortable feeling that leaving a marriage might not have been the actions I thought it was. It might have been the beginning of something I hadn't yet learned how to recognize. I didn't expect Victor Hale to ask for me directly. Not through Richard, not through a lawyer, not through one of those carefully worded family messages that pretend politeness is the same thing as distance. He simply called. Or at least, his assistant did. A calm voice. No urgency, no explanation. Just a request. Mr. Hale would like to meet with you privately, she said. Not suggest, not request if convenient. Would like. Like it was already decided, and my participation was the only variable left unresolved. The meeting was scheduled for the next evening, a private office in downtown Boston, not the Hales estate, not a restaurant, not a home setting. Neutral ground, at least on paper, but nothing about it felt neutral. I remember standing in front of my mirror that night longer than necessary, not getting ready, just observing myself, trying to decide what version of me was walking into that room. Doctor wife, soon to be ex-wife, or something else I hadn't named yet. In medicine, identity is simple. You are what you do under pressure. But this wasn't tea surgery. There was no protocol for this kind of uncertainty. The building was exactly what I expected from Victor Hale without ever having consciously formed that expectation. Glass, steel, Minimal signage. Security that did look like security, unless you knew what to look for. The kind of place where power does announce itself because it assumes you already understand it's there. I was escorted to an elevator without being asked for identification. That detail stayed with me more than anything else, because it meant I had already been recognized before I arrived. The elevator ride was too smooth, too quiet, the kind of silence that feels engineered. When the doors opened, I was not surprised by the hallway. Expensive wood, soft lighting, no visible staff. Everything designed to make you feel like you were alone, while also making it clear you were not unobserved. Victor's office door was already open. He was standing near the window when I entered, not seated, not behind a desk, just standing there like he had been waiting without impatience. He didn't turn immediately. He spoke first. "You arrived alone," he said. Not a question, a confirmation. "Yes," I replied. He finally turned then. And for the first time since I had met him, I saw him in a context that was too social. No dinner table, no family structure, no background noise of polite conversation, just him. And the room he controlled. He looked older than Richard, but not fragile, not softened by age. If anything, time had made him more precise, like everything unnecessary had already been removed long ago. He gestured toward a chair across from him. "Sit," he said. I did. Not because I felt compelled, but because refusing felt irrelevant. There are people who ask, and there are people who assume participation is already decided. Victor Hale belonged to the second category. He sat only after I did, a small detail, but noticeable. He didn't start with small talk. He didn't ask how I was adjusting. He didn't acknowledge the divorce directly. Instead, he said something unexpected. "I didn't you are considering leaving my son," he said. "Yes," I said. He nodded once. Not judgmental, not emotional. Just recorded. "I assumed as much," he said. A pause followed. Not awkward, just deliberate. Then he continued. "Richard believes you don't understand what you are stepping away from." I studied him carefully. "And you?" I asked. "I believe understanding is not the same as agreement," he replied. That answer was more precise than I expected. It wasn't he defensive. It wasn't he persuasive. It was structural. Like he was describing how systems behave rather than how people feel. I leaned slightly forward. "Then explain it," I said. Clearly. For the first time, something like mild interest appeared in his expression. Not surprise. Recognition. "You want clarity," he said. "I want reality," I replied. That earned a faint pause. Then he nodded slowly. "Good," he said, and that was when I realized something subtle. This wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't even persuasion. It was evaluation. He was not trying to keep me. He was trying to measure what leaving me would cost. Victor walked toward his desk and sat down. For the first time, he looked slightly less like a man observing a system and slightly more like part of one. "My family," he said, "did not become what it is through visibility." I didn't respond, he continued. "Most people misunderstand power. They think it requires force, noise, control through presence, a pause that is not efficient." I narrowed my eyes slightly. "And what is efficient?" I asked. He looked at me directly. "Dependency," he said. The word landed differently than I expected. Not emotional, not threatening, technical. "Like a principle rather than a confession," he continued. "Systems endure when the parts within them believe they are operating freely while remaining structurally interconnected." I felt a slow tightening in my chest. Not fear, not yet. Recognition without full comprehension. "I'm not part of your system," I said. He didn't react immediately. Then, almost calmly, he said, "You already are." Silence followed. Not heavy, not dramatic, just complete. I studied him for a long moment. Then I asked the question I hadn't yet fully formed until that second. "What exactly are you involved in, Mr. Hale?" He tilted his head slightly. "You think in categories," he said. "Legal, illegal, moral, immoral." A pause, that is understandable, but incomplete. "I didn't he respond," he continued. "My work exists in systems that predate those categories and outlive them." That sentence should have sounded like nonsense. But it didn't he. It sounded rehearsed only in the sense that someone had spent decades refining how to explain something that could never fully be simplified. I leaned back slightly. "You re-speaking in abstractions," I said. "No," he replied. "I am speaking carefully." A pause. Then he added something that shifted the atmosphere again. Your work saves individual lives, he said. Mine preserves structures that determine which lives are possible to save. That was the first moment I felt something close to unease. Not because of what he said, but because of how rational it sounded. Victor leaned back in his chair. Your decision to leave my son is not emotional in its consequences, he continued. It is structural. I exhaled slowly. That's a convenient way to make personal control sound like necessity, I said. A faint pause. Then, to my surprise, he almost smiled. Perhaps, he admitted, that honesty made him more unsettling, not less. Because it removed the obvious defense I had prepared for. He wasn't pretending morality. He wasn't hiding behind kindness. He was simply describing how his world functioned and expecting me to understand that acknowledgement was enough. I shifted slightly in my seat. You should be telling me I can to leave, I said. No, he replied. A pause. I am telling you that leaving has consequences you have not accounted for. I studied him carefully. And what are those consequences? I asked. He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice lowered slightly. Disruption, he said. A pause. And disruption creates exposure. I narrowed my eyes. Exposure to what? He looked at me for a long moment, then said, to systems you have been inside longer than you realize. That sentence should have sounded like manipulation, but instead it sounded like confirmation of something I had already begun to suspect without wanting to admit it. That the structure I thought I had joined through marriage might have existed long before I ever entered it. I stood up slowly. The conversation had reached a point where continued listening felt less like gaining information and more like being slowly redefined. Victor didn't stop me. He simply spoke one last time as I reached the door. Richard is not asking you to stay, he said. I paused. He is asking you not to misunderstand what leaving means. I turned slightly. For whom? I asked. Victor looked at me calmly. For you, he said, and then he added, almost gently, because understanding usually arrives after consequences, not before them. I left the office without responding. The elevator ride down felt longer than the ride up. Not because of time, because of thought. The kind of thought that does form conclusions yet, but rearranges assumptions quietly in the background. By the time I reached the street, the city felt unchanged. That was the most disturbing part. Nothing outside reflected what had just been said inside that room. No visible shift, no external acknowledgement, just me. And the slow realization that I had just spoken to a man who didn't view family as emotion, but as infrastructure. And I was no longer entirely sure whether I had been invited to leave it or quietly evaluated for what would happen if I tried. I didn't sleep much after meeting Victor Hale. Not because I was afraid, at least, not in the way fear is usually defined. There was no panic, no shaking hands, no dramatic spiral into doubt. It was something quieter than that. More like a system in my mind refusing to fully shut down, replaying, reordering, testing every sentence he had said against everything I thought I knew about the world I was living in. By morning, I had convinced myself of something simple. People like Victor Hale don't operate outside reality. They operate inside a version of it most people never learn how to see. And that thought stayed with me as I walked into the hospital that morning. Boston in general always smelled the same at 6 antiseptic, coffee, exhaustion. A mixture that somehow passed for normal in a place where life and death were routine paperwork. I liked that predictability. It grounded me, or at least it used to. That morning, it didn't because now, even the hospital felt slightly different. Not in structure, in awareness. Like I had been told there was something beneath it, and now I couldn't stop wondering where to look for it. I was reviewing post-op scans when Nora walked into my office without knocking. She always did that when something was on her mind. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it. You look like you didn't sleep, she said. I didn't, I replied. She studied me for a moment. Is this about the divorce, she asked. I hesitated. No, I said. That was technically true, but incomplete. Nora tilted her head slightly. Then, what is? I looked back at the monitor. Brain imaging, clean surgical outcome, predictable recovery curve. Things that made sense. I met Richard's father yesterday, I said finally. That made her pause. Not dramatically. Just enough to register interest. The billionaire philanthropist? She asked. I almost corrected her phrasing. Almost, but I didn't. Something like that, I said. Nora stepped closer. And? I exhaled slowly. And I think I misunderstood what kind of family I married into. That made her expression shift slightly. Not concern yet, but focus. Meaning? She asked. I didn't answer immediately, because I didn't have a clean answer. Instead, I said something simpler. He doesn't think in personal terms, I said. Nora frowned slightly. Most rich people don't, she replied. No, I said. This is different. That made her stop. She pulled a chair closer and sat down. Now she was fully listening, I continued. He talks about systems like they re-alive, I said. Not businesses, not organizations, systems. Nora gave a small shrug. That sounds like corporate language, she said. It didn't feel like corporate language, I replied. A pause. She studied me more carefully now, Camila, she said. More slowly, what exactly are you worried about? I hesitated again, because putting it into words made it real in a way I wasn't for. I'm not sure yet, I said honestly, and that was the most truthful thing I had said all morning. By noon, I had 3 surgeries scheduled, 2 elective, 1 emergency. Work helped. It always did, because in the operating room, everything reduces to precision. There is no ambiguity, no hidden meaning, only anatomy, only outcome. But even in surgery that day, something felt slightly off. Not in the patients, in me. A kind of distraction I couldn't fully suppress. Like part of my mind was still sitting in that office with Victor Hale, listening to words I didn't yet have a framework for. After the last procedure, I went back to my office and closed the door. That S when I saw it. A report on my desk I didn't remember ordering. At first, I thought it was administrative paperwork, hospital supply chain review, standard audit documentation. But as I flipped through it, something caught my attention. Medication distribution logs, pharmaceutical routing records, and discrepancies. Small ones. Not enough to trigger immediate alarms, not enough to be illegal on their own, but consistent, patterned. The kind of pattern you only notice when you stop looking at individual cases and start looking at flow. I leaned forward slightly. This wasn't part of my job. Neurosurgery didn't involve hospital logistics, at least not directly. So why was this on my desk? I called Nora. She arrived within minutes. This wasn't here yesterday, I said, sliding the file toward her. She opened it, scanning quickly. What am I looking at? She asked. Medication tracking inconsistencies, I said. Nora frowned. That S not your department, she said. I know, I replied. That made her look up. Now fully alert. Who sent it? She asked. I shook my head. I don't know. We reviewed it together in silence. The more we looked, the more structured it became. Not random errors, not clerical mistakes, controlled redirection points, small shifts in distribution routes. Certain pharmaceutical shipments consistently passing through intermediary companies that didn't appear on standard procurement chains. Nora leaned back slightly. This is above hospital admin level, she said quietly. I know, I replied. She looked at me. You think this is connected to your father-in-law? She asked. I didn't answer immediately, because the question itself felt like a step too far into something I didn't fully understand yet. But I didn't deny it either. That silence was enough for her. She closed the file slowly. Camila, she said, this kind of thing doesn't just exist in isolation. If there's manipulation in supply chains this clean, it usually means coordination outside the hospital. I nodded slowly. I figured that much, I said. Nora studied me for a long moment. Then she said something quieter. You were not a part of that, right? I hesitated, and that hesitation answered the question more honestly than words could have. I don't know yet, I said. That evening I went home later than usual. Richard was already there, sitting at the kitchen table, same posture. Silence. He looked up when I entered. You reworking late, he said. Hospital stuff, I replied. He nodded. No follow-up questions, no curiosity, just acknowledgement. That should have felt familiar by now, but it didn't. Not anymore. I placed my bag down and leaned against the counter. Did your father ever mention hospital supply chains? I asked casually. Richard didn't react immediately. That pause was small, but noticeable. Then he said, he oversees healthcare investments. Why? I watched him carefully. No reason, I said. He accepted that, too easily, too cleanly. That was the second time that day I noticed something didn't feel like coincidence anymore. Later that night, after Richard went upstairs, I stayed in the kitchen. The house was quiet, too quiet. I opened the report again, read it slowly, line by line, and something inside it started forming a shape I didn't want to recognize. Not illegal activity, not obvious corruption. Something more subtle, control through infrastructure, through routing, through dependency. And that was when I understood something I didn't want to understand. This wasn't about medicine, it was about access. Who gets it, when they get it, and through what channels it passes before it reaches them. I closed the file slowly. My hands were steady, but my thoughts were in T. Because if this was intentional, then Victor Hale was T just observing systems. He was shaping them. And I had just walked into a structure where every connection I thought was independent might already be part of something I hadn't yet learned how to see. I turned off the light in the kitchen. And for the first time since I had decided to leave my marriage, I was shunned to sure I was actually stepping out of anything at all. I might have been stepping deeper in. I started noticing the house before I noticed the people again. That was the part I didn't expect. Not Victor Hale. Not Richard. Not the quiet structure behind their conversations. The house itself. Because once you begin to suspect a system exists, you stop seeing spaces as neutral, they become intentional. And nothing in that home felt neutral anymore. It was late evening when I returned after another long shift at the hospital. Richard was already home. That was becoming more common lately. He stood in the kitchen when I walked in, staring at something on his phone. He looked up briefly. "You late again," he said. "I had surgery," I replied. A pause. He nodded. Of course, that tone again. Flat. Controlled. Not accusatory. Not emotional. Just recorded. Like my explanation was a data point that matched expectation. I moved past him, placed my bag on the counter. Something felt slightly different in the house that night. Not atmosphere, not lighting, presence. Like there were more layers of attention than usual. I couldn't explain why I felt that. Only that I did. Richard poured himself a glass of water. "You should rest," he said. "I will," I replied. He hesitated slightly, then added, "My father asked about you earlier." That made me pause. Not dramatically, just enough to register. "What did he ask?" I said. Richard shrugged slightly. "Nothing specific," he said, "just whether you were adjusting." That was not a question I trusted anymore, because Victor Hale didn't ask questions casually. Everything had structure, function, purpose. I turned toward the staircase. "Tell him, I am fine," I said. Richard nodded once. "I already did," he replied. I stopped for a fraction of a second, then continued upstairs. That small exchange stayed with me longer than it should have, because it implied something I didn't like naming yet. That communication about me was happening without me, not secretively in the obvious sense, but routinely, like I was already part of a shared system of reference. That night, I couldn't sleep, so I walked through the house, quiet, barefoot, moving slowly so the floor wouldn't creak, not because I was afraid of being caught, but because movement helped me think. I stopped near the hallway outside Richard S. study. The door was slightly open, light inside. He was inside, speaking quietly on the phone. I didn't mean to listen, but I did know. "She has to ask directly, yet," he said. A pause. "Yes, I know what she found." Another pause. "No, she does to understand the structure yet." My body went still, not fear. "Recognition," he continued. "Father believes she's so observant enough to become a risk if left without context." A longer pause. Then Richard lowered his voice further. "Yes, I understand. I'm handling it silence." Then the call ended. I stepped back quietly. My heart rate didn't spike. That was the strangest part. It should have. But instead, my mind moved immediately into analysis. Not emotion. Structure. He was to hiding things from me emotionally. He was managing information flow. Like timing mattered more than truth. Like knowledge itself had scheduling. I returned to room and sat on the edge of the bed. The house felt different now. Not because anything had changed physically, but because I could no longer assume I was outside its internal awareness. I had become part of its observation radius. The next morning, I went to the hospital early. Too early. Before most staff arrived. I needed clarity. And clarity, for me, always came through work. Nora met me in the hallway near the surgical wing. You look worse than yesterday, she said immediately. I didn't sleep, I replied. She studied me. This is still about Richard's family? I didn't answer Mullins immediately. We walked together toward my office. Yes, I said finally. Nora exhaled slowly. Camila, she said, you need to decide what you actually want to know. I stopped walking. So did she. What do you mean? I asked. She crossed her arms. Because right now, she said, you recollecting pieces without a structure. And that S how people end up seeing patterns that aren't real or worse, missing ones that are. I understood what she meant. But I also knew she didn't have the full picture. I think there is a structure, I said. Nora narrowed her eyes slightly. And you think Richard's family is part of it, she said. I didn't deny it. That's silence again. Nora sighed then. Ask him directly, she said. It's not that simple, I replied. It usually ends to, she said. We reached my office. Before she left, she paused. Camila, she said more quietly. Whatever this is, don't let it isolate you. Then she left. I stayed standing in the room for a moment. Isolation. That was an interesting word in this context. Because I didn't feel isolated, I felt observed. Which is different. At noon, I received a message I didn't expect. No name, no sender ID, just a location, a private address near the harbor and a time. 5 p.m. No explanation, no signature. But I already knew who it was from. Victor Hale didn't send invitations casually. He sent instructions disguised as choices. I considered ignoring it for about 12 minutes. Then I stopped pretending I had that option, because at this point, not going would also be a decision. And I was no longer convinced neutrality existed in this situation. I arrived at the location just before 5. It was an office this time, not a corporate building. It was older, industrial, near the water where Boston's infrastructure becomes less polished and more functional. Inside, it was what I expected. Not empty, not abandoned. Organized, storage, records, equipment I could immediately categorize, and Victor was already there, standing near a long table. Waiting, of course. He didn't greet me. He didn't acknowledge delay or punctuality. He simply said, noticing things faster than Richard predicted. I stopped a few feet from him. I didn't come here to be evaluated, I said. He nodded slightly. I know, he replied. A pause. That's why you came anyway. That landed more accurately than I liked. I looked around the room. What is this place? I asked. Victor gestured slightly toward the space. An archive, he said. Audit records, I replied. Among other things, he said. I narrowed my eyes. Why am I here? He studied me for a moment, then said something unexpected. Because you started seeing patterns, he said. A pause. And patterns without context become assumptions. I didn't, I respond, he continued. I don't allow assumptions to destabilize structures I built, he said. That was the first time he had spoken in purely personal terms. Not abstract systems, not philosophy, but ownership. I exhaled slowly. So this is where you correct me, I said. He shook his head slightly. No, he said. Another pause. This is where I decide whether you are a variable or a disruption. That word again. Disruption. I looked at him directly. You were talking about me like I am part of your infrastructure, I said. He didn't deny it. That was the answer. Victor walked slowly toward the table. I didn't choose that framing, he said. You did, I replied. He paused, then nodded once. Correct, he said. Silence filled the space, not uncomfortable, just heavy with implication. Then he added something quieter. But you are not wrong to suspect that your presence inside this family has consequences beyond emotional relationships. I felt my focus sharpen. Define consequences, I said. Victor looked at me for a long moment, then said, exposure, alignment, dependency. He spoke each word carefully, like labeling compartments in a system only he fully understood. I crossed my arms slightly. I am not dependent on this family, I said. Victor tilted his head slightly. Not yet, he replied. That word stayed in the air longer than it should have. Not yet. Not as prediction. As timeline. I studied him carefully. You trying to tell me something, I said. I am, he replied. A pause. But not everything. That was the moment I realized the most important truth so far. Victor Hale wasn't withholding information to control me emotionally. He was withholding it to control sequencing. He believed timing mattered more than truth. And that belief itself was the structure everything else rested on. I took a slow breath. Then tell me what I need to know, I said. Victor looked at me for a long moment. then said quietly, "You are closer to the center of this than Richard has allowed you to understand." A pause. "And once you see the center clearly, you will not be able to unsee what surrounds it." I didn't respond immediately, because for the first time, I understood something important. I had not been entering a family. I had been entering a framework I hadn't yet fully mapped. And I was no longer sure whether I was learning it or already inside it too deeply to step back out. It didn't happen all at once. That's how I knew it was real. Real systems don't collapse loudly. They adjust, they test, they respond. And only then, if necessary, do they escalate. The first sign was subtle. A delay in hospital supply delivery. Not critical, not urgent, just enough to notice if you were already paying attention. A shipment of neurosurgical equipment I had approved weeks earlier didn't arrive on time. No explanation, no error message, no system alert. Just absence. Nora mentioned it casually in passing. "Logistics is a mess today," she said while reviewing schedules. I nodded, but I was listening to her tone. I was listening to the implication, because I had seen enough patterns now to recognize when randomness stopped behaving randomly. By afternoon, it happened again. A patient referral delayed, then a second supply inconsistency, then a meeting that got rescheduled without explanation. Small things, independent things, on paper. But together they formed something I couldn't ignore anymore. A pressure pattern, not chaos, control through disruption, and I knew exactly who I needed to think about. Victor Hale. That evening, I went to the harbor facility again.
I didn't call ahead this time. I didn't need to.
The door was unlocked when I arrived. That alone told me everything. I stepped inside slowly. Victor was already there.
Waiting, as always.
He'd turn immediately. He spoke first. "You noticed," he said. Not a question, a confirmation. "Yes," I replied. He turned slightly toward me. "And you recognized the pattern," he continued. I didn't respond, because I was unsure yet whether I was supposed to admit that. Victor studied me carefully, then nodded once. "Good," he said. That single word should have felt like approval. It didn't. It felt like calibration. I stepped further into the room. "You re-interfering with hospital operations," he said. Victor didn't react immediately. Then he replied calmly, "I am not interfering. I am observing response thresholds." I narrowed my eyes. "By disrupting supply chains?" He nodded slightly. "Yes," he said. A pause. "Controlled pressure reveals structural dependencies." I felt something tighten in my chest, not fear exactly. Frustration. "You retreating healthcare like an experiment," I said. Victor looked at me directly now. "No," he replied. Another pause. "I am treating it like a system that already exists," he said. That distinction mattered to him, I could tell, but it didn't make it easier to accept. I crossed my arms. "And what exactly are you trying to prove?" I asked. Victor walked slowly toward the table in the center of the room. He placed his hands lightly on its surface. "I am not proving anything," he said. A pause. "I am identifying whether your presence within this structure stabilizes it or introduces unpredictability." I stared at him. "So I am a variable," I said. He didn't deny it. That silence again. I exhaled slowly. "You re-manipulating hospital systems to study reaction," I said. Victor nodded once. "Yes," he replied. No hesitation, no justification, just acknowledgement. That was what made him dangerous. Not secrecy, clarity. I stepped closer. "You don't see a problem with that?" I asked. He tilted his head slightly. "I see necessity," he said. A pause. "Understanding requires stress testing. Otherwise you are only observing ideal conditions." I shook my head slightly. "This is T-theory," I said. "These are real patients." Victor's expression didn't change. "I am aware," he said. That was the most unsettling part. He wasn't detached. He wasn't ignorant. He was fully aware of the cost and proceeding anyway. I lowered my voice slightly. "You not testing systems," I said. "You controlling them." Victor looked at me for a long moment, then said quietly, "All systems are controlled," he replied. A pause. "The only question is by whom, and with what transparency." That answer didn't comfort me. It reframed everything. And I hated how logical it sounded. I turned slightly away from him, looking at the structure of the room, the organized records, the equipment, the controlled environment. This was a hideout. It was infrastructure, just not the kind most people ever see. "I want you to stop," I said. Victor didn't respond immediately. Then he said, "That is not how this works." I turned back to him. What does that mean? He stepped closer, just slightly. It means you have already interacted with the system, he said. A pause. And systems do not respond well to selective disengagement. I felt my jaw tighten. So I am trapped inside it, I said. Victor shook his head slightly. No, he said. Another pause. You are inside it because you are now a known point of reference. That sentence hit differently. Not emotional, structural again. I looked at him carefully. Then what happens now? I asked. Victor studied me for a long moment, then said something I didn't expect now. He said, "We see how others respond to your presence." I frowned. Others? I repeated. Before he could answer, my phone vibrated. Once. Then again. I looked down. A message from Nora. Short. Urgent. Hospital admin is asking for you. Something about surgical supply authorization discrepancies. They want you in a meeting tomorrow morning. I felt the shift immediately. Not confusion. Confirmation. I looked back up at Victor. He was already watching me. You did this, I said quietly. He didn't deny that silence again, but this time it felt different. He wasn't confirming guilt. He was confirming outcome. I took a slow breath. Why? I asked. Victor walked back toward the table. Because your role within the system is now visible, he said. A pause. And visibility produces reaction. I stared at him. You reprovoking the hospital, I said. I am revealing dependencies, he corrected. I shook my head slightly. That's the same thing, I said. Victor looked at me directly. No, he said. Another pause. Reactions are not inherently negative, he added. I felt something cold settle in my chest. This isn't academic, I said. Victor stepped closer again, just slightly. Nothing I do is academic, he replied. A pause. It is operational. That word stayed with me. Operational, not theoretical, not philosophical, functional. I looked at him carefully. You re-escalating this, I said. Victor didn't deny it. Instead, he said something quieter. I am preparing for exposure, he said. I narrowed my eyes. Exposure to what? He paused, then answered simply. To the parts of this system that do not respond to controlled observation. That was the first time I felt something close to genuine unease. Not because of threat, but because of scale. This wasn't about hospital logistics anymore, or even family structure. It was something larger, and I was no longer sure where I fit inside it. I stepped back slightly. I didn't agree to any of this, I said. Victor looked at me calmly. You didn't need to, he replied. A pause. You are already inside the structure through association. That word again, association. I exhaled slowly. This is my life you re-manipulating, I said. Victor tilted his head slightly. I am not manipulating your life, he said. A pause. I am observing how it intersects with systems that already exist. That distinction was the most dangerous thing he had said so far, because it removed intent and replaced it with inevitability. I looked at him for a long moment, then asked quietly, Does Richard know you redoing this? Victor didn't hesitate. Yes, he said. That was worse than I expected. I felt my focus sharpen instantly. And he agreed? I asked. Victor studied me, then said carefully, He understands the necessity of controlled pressure. I felt my chest tighten. So it was just Victor, it was coordinated. I stepped back again, processing that fully now. This wasn't observation anymore. It was alignment. I looked at him one last time. You returning me into leverage, I said. Victor didn't deny it. Instead, he said something quieter. No, he replied. A pause. You are becoming a reference point, he said. That sounded almost identical. But it was and that difference mattered more than I wanted it to. I turned toward the exit. I am not part of this, I said. Victor spoke one final time before I reached the door. You already are, he said calmly. And now, he added, we will see what the system does with that fact. I left without replying. But as I stepped outside into the cold Boston air, I realized something I didn't want to admit yet. This was no longer about discovering truth. It was about surviving the consequences of being observed inside a system that had already decided I was no longer invisible. The first real consequence didn't look like danger. It looked like paperwork. That was always the mistake people made when they underestimated systems like this. They expected violence, noise, immediate disruption, but real systems didn't announce themselves that way. They arrived quietly, through official channels, wearing language that sounded normal, until it was tea. The hospital meeting request came at 7:14 a.m., mandatory. Administrative review. Supply chain audit. My name listed as the attending physician responsible for recent procedural authorizations irregularities. Irregularities. That word again. Soft enough to sound procedural, vague enough to be dangerous. Nora found me before I even reached my office. Her expression told me everything before she spoke. This isn't routine, she said immediately. I know, I replied. She lowered her voice. They've already pulled 3 departments into review, she said, and your name keeps coming up. I exhaled slowly. That's not possible, I said. But even as I said it, I knew it was already happening. Because Victor Hale didn't create chaos. He created visibility, and visibility always forced systems to react. That was the point. We walked together toward my office. Nora kept her voice low. Camila, she said, this feels coordinated. I didn't answer immediately, because feels was no longer the right category for what was happening. This was structured, intentional. I stopped outside my office door. Did they say who initiated the review? I asked. Nora hesitated. Legal Oversight Board, she said. But it's not normal timing. That was all I needed to hear. I pushed the door open slowly. Inside, my desk had already been reorganized, not touched randomly, reordered, files stacked differently. A printed agenda placed precisely in the center, and at the top of it, my name. I stood still for a moment. This wasn't an audit, it was a signal. I felt it immediately. Victor's influence didn't need to be visible to be effective. It only needed to be structural enough to trigger institutional reflex. I picked up the agenda, read it once then again. Nora stepped in behind me. You're not in trouble, she said, though she didn't sound convinced. I know, I replied, but I wasn't sure that was true anymore. Because trouble implied randomness. This felt directed. I set the paper down carefully. I need to attend the meeting, I said. Nora frowned. Alone? She asked. I hesitated. Yes, I said, but even as I said it, I wasn't sure why. The meeting room was in the administrative wing. Neutral lighting. Neutral furniture. Neutral everything. The kind of room designed to make power feel procedural instead of personal. There were 6 people already inside when I arrived. 3 hospital administrators, 1 legal representative, 1 external consultant, and Richard. That was the first real disruption in my breathing pattern. He stood when I entered. Not immediately. Just enough delay to make it feel intentional rather than emotional. I sat down without acknowledging him. The lead administrator began immediately. No introduction, no preamble. Dr. Voss, she said, this review concerns discrepancies in surgical supply authorization linked to your department. I nodded once. I understand, I said. She continued. There are patterns suggesting external influence on procurement routes. That phrase again. Patterns. I kept my expression steady. Can you define external influence? I asked. A pause. The legal representative spoke this time. We were still determining scope, he said. Translation. They didn't understand it yet. Or they didn't want to say it out loud. I glanced briefly at Richard. He was watching me, not them. Not reacting. Observing, like this was a controlled environment he had already been briefed on. The administrator continued. Your authorization codes appear in multiple flagged transactions, she said. That's not possible, I replied immediately. My voice stayed calm, but firm. Then explain how they appear, she added. I leaned forward slightly. I don't control hospital logistics systems, I said. The consultant spoke then. That's what makes this unusual, he said. A pause. Your access level shouldn't intersect with procurement routing, he continued. And yet it does. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not fear, recognition. Because this wasn't about me. It was about exposure points. I turned slightly toward the administrator. Who initiated this review? I asked again. She hesitated. External compliance pressure, sure, she said. That wasn't an answer. It was a deflection. I looked at Richard again. This time he spoke, calmly. You should cooperate, he said. That was the first time he had spoken in the meeting. I studied him carefully. Cooperate with what exactly? I asked. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he said something that made the room shift slightly. Clarification is better than escalation, he said. I held his gaze. Whose escalation? I asked quietly. He didn't respond. That silence was enough. The administrator cleared her throat. We need confirmation on whether you were aware of irregular routing activity, she said. I shook my head slightly. No, I said. That's not part of my responsibilities. The legal consultant made a note, too quickly, too prepared. I noticed it immediately. This wasn't tea discovery, it was confirmation gathering. I exhaled slowly. This feels targeted, I said. The room didn't react, which told me everything I needed to know. Because denial without denial is confirmation. The meeting continued for another 20 minutes, most of it procedural, questions, clarifications, repetitions, but underneath it all there was something else. A structure tightening, not round the hospital, round me. When it ended, I stood up first, no acknowledgement, no conclusion, just movement. Richard followed me out into the hallway. Camila, he said quietly. I stopped but didn't turn. This is getting out of control, he continued. I finally looked at him. Out of control for whom? I asked. He hesitated. That's not what I meant, he said, but it was exactly what he meant. I studied him for a long moment. You knew about this, I said. It wasn't a question, he didn't deny it. That silence again. I nodded once, slowly. So did your father, I said. Richard looked away briefly, not guilt. Calculation. I tried to slow it down, he said. That was the most honest thing he had said all day. But it didn't matter anymore. Because systems respond to attempts to slow them down once they be already reacting. They continue, they correct, they complete cycles. I stepped back slightly. What happens now? I asked. Richard looked at me directly. This depends on your response, he said. That was the first time I understood the real shift. This wasn't tea investigation. It was positioning, and I was already inside it. That evening, I went to the harbor facility again. I didn't need to be invited this time. The door was open. Victor was already there. Of course he was. He didn't turn when I entered. He spoke immediately. You experienced institutional response, he said. I stopped a few feet behind him. Yes, I replied. He nodded slightly. And now you understand scope, he continued. I crossed my arms slowly. You triggered a hospital audit, I said. Victor finally turned. Yes, he replied calmly. No hesitation, no justification, just confirmation. I studied him carefully. Why? I asked. He walked slowly toward the table. Because you have now been identified as a node of interaction within the systems, he said. I frowned slightly. A node, I repeated. Yes, he said. A pause. And nodes produce measurable reaction patterns when pressure is applied. I shook my head slightly. You retreating me like data, I said. Victor looked at me directly. You are data, he replied. That was the moment everything clarified. Not emotionally, structurally. I exhaled slowly. So this is what I am to you, I said. Victor didn't deny it. Instead, he said something quieter. And now he added, you are also visible to others. That sentence changed the air in the room. I narrowed my eyes. Others? I asked. Victor nodded once. Yes, he said. A pause. Because systems do not remain isolated once exposed. I felt something cold settle in my chest. This is spreading, I said quietly. Victor didn't correct me that silence again. But this time, it felt final. I looked at him for a long moment, then asked the only question that mattered now. Who else is watching? Victor studied me carefully, then said, That, he replied, is what we are about to find out. The first sign that things had changed wasn't he another meeting. It wasn't he another suspension notice. It was my name disappearing from places it used to belong. Not erased, just no longer prioritized. Like the system had quietly decided I was no longer central to how it functioned. That S how institutional silence works. It does T announce rejection. It simply stops recognizing you as necessary. I noticed it at the hospital cafeteria first. My badge still worked. The doors still opened. But people didn't look at me the same way anymore. Not fear. Not hostility. Reclassification. As if they were unsure what role I occupied now. Nora noticed it too. You being treated differently, she said quietly as we walked through the corridor. I know, I replied. She frowned. This is normal, she said. Even for administrative issues. I stopped walking. Nothing about this is administrative anymore, I said. That was the truth I had been circling for days. But now I was finally saying it out loud. By afternoon, I no longer had access to surgical schedules, not officially. But unofficially, I could still see patterns, delays, reroutes, approvals moving without me. Someone else had stepped into my absence. Not to replace me. To reroute around me. That distinction mattered. I sat in my office longer than usual that day, staring at the same system I had once controlled without thinking. Now it functioned without me, efficiently, almost carefully. And I realized something uncomfortable. This wasn't punishment, it was testing stability without my input. A knock came at the door. Nora entered slowly. "Your father-in-law's office called," she said. I looked up immediately. That was new. "They want you to come in," she added. I stood up. "When?" I asked. "Tonight," she said. A pause. "Private." That word changed the tone of everything. Private meant outside institutional observation, outside structure, which meant Victor wasn't operating through the hospital anymore. He was operating around it. I left at 7:40 p.m. The harbor facility felt different this time, quieter, not empty, controlled, like the building itself was waiting. Victor was already there when I entered, but this time he was alone. Richard stood near the back of the room, arms crossed, watching, not intervening, observing. That alone told me enough. Victor turned slowly. "You've adjusted," he says. Not a question, a statement. "I've adapted," I corrected. He nodded once. "Yes," he said, "that's the first stage." I didn't like the way that sounded. Stages meant progression, and progression meant I was still inside something I hadn't agreed to. I looked at Richard. "You re-involved in this now?" I asked. Richard didn't answer immediately. Then, "I've always been adjacent," he said. That wasn't a denial. It was confirmation in softer language. I turned back to Victor. "What do you want now?" I asked. Victor studied me for a moment, then said something I didn't. He said, a pause. "What the system is preparing to request." He frowned. I frowned. "The system?" I repeated. He nodded. "Yes." A pause. "It has recognized your presence as a stabilizing anomaly," he said. I crossed my arms slowly. "I am a person," I said. Victor didn't react to that. Instead, he replied, "You are a functional variable inside overlapping structures," he said. That phrasing again. Cold, precise, detached. I felt my patience thin slightly. "And what happens to functional variables?" I asked. Victor looked at me directly. "They are either integrated," he said, "or removed." Followed that sentence. Even Richard didn't move. I exhaled slowly. "So I am a problem to be solved," I said. Victor corrected me immediately. "No," he said, a pause. "You are a reference point that forces recalibration." That sounded worse, because it meant I wasn't being targeted. I was being measured against. I stepped closer. "What happens if I refuse recalibration?" I asked. Victor studied me carefully, then answered honestly. "Then you become unstable within the system," he said. "And unstable points are eventually contained." The room felt smaller after that. I looked at Richard again. He finally spoke. "This isn't optional anymore," he said quietly. I held his gaze. "For who?" I asked. He didn't answer. That silence again. But this one was different. It was avoidance. It was confirmation he didn't have authority to speak beyond. I turned back to Victor. "You re-preparing something," I said. He nodded once. "Yes." A pause. "The system is requesting resolution parameters," he said. I frowned. "Resolution? For what?" Touched me. "Your positions," he said simply. That was the first time I felt something shift inside me. Not fear, understanding. I stepped back slightly. "So this is it," I said quietly. Victor didn't correct me. Richard didn't interrupt. I looked between them both. "This isn't a hospital politics," I said. "No," Victor agreed. "This is evaluation." I let that sink in, then asked the only question that mattered. "Who decides the outcome?" Victor paused, then answered. "Not me." That was the first honest limitation he had ever admitted. I narrowed my eyes. "Then who?" Victor looked at me for a long moment, and for the first time his voice carried something close to gravity. "People who don't appear in rooms like this," he said. A pause. "And systems that don't operate at human speed." That changed everything, because it meant I was no longer inside a conflict I could see. I was inside one I could only experience. I stepped back toward the door. "What happens now?" I asked. Victor didn't move, he said. "You are observed until the system completes classification." I left without another word. Outside, the air felt colder than it should have. Boston was still there, still functioning, still unaware. But I wasn't a part of its blind spots anymore. I was inside its field of view, and I finally understood what Victor meant when he first said I had become visible. Visibility wasn't recognition. It was exposure to forces that didn't need permission to evaluate you. And somewhere, without my control, the system had already started deciding what I would become next. It didn't end the way I expected. Nothing like this ever does. There was no final meeting. No formal decision. No moment where someone looked at me and said it was over. Instead, things simply stopped tightening, like a hand slowly releasing its grip without announcing it had ever been closed. That morning, I went to the hospital out of habit more than necessity. No summons, no notices, no restrictions waiting at the door. Just silence where pressure used to be. Nora met me in the corridor, but this time her expression was different, not concerned, not alert, relieved. "It is done," she said quietly. I stopped walking. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then exhaled. "The review was closed," she said. "No findings, no escalation, no further action." I studied her face. That didn't sound like resolution. It sounded like withdrawal. "Who closed it?" I asked. She shook her head. "No official record," she said. "It just ended." That word again. Ended, not resolved, not concluded. Ended. I nodded once, slowly, because I understood something I didn't want to say out loud yet. This wasn't victory, it was disengagement. By afternoon, my access was quietly restored, not announced, not apologized for, just returned, like nothing had ever happened. But I could still feel the shape of it, the absence it left behind. That evening, I went to the harbor facility one last time. I didn't expect anyone to be there, but Victor was. Of course he was. He stood near the window, looking out at the water. He didn't turn when I entered. He spoke first. "The system has completed evaluation," he said. I stopped a few feet behind him. "And?" I asked. A pause. "It has deprioritized further observation," he said. That was the first time I understood what release meant in his world. Not safety, not closure, just removal from active classification. I crossed my arms slowly. "So I'm no longer a variable," I said. Victor finally turned. "You were never just a variable," he said. A pause. "You were a disruption point that resolved itself without escalation." I frowned slightly. "That's your conclusion?" He nodded once. "Yes." Silence settled between us for a moment. Not heavy, just final. I looked at him carefully. "So what now?" I asked. Victor studied me for a long time before answering. "Now you return to your system," he said, a pause. "And it will behave as though nothing happened." That sounded wrong. But it was probably accurate. That's how institutions survive exposure, they normalize it after the fact. I stepped closer. "And you?" I asked. Victor didn't answer immediately. "Then I returned to observation," he said. A pause. "Elsewhere." That was the closest thing to departure he had ever given me. I studied him for a moment. "You never really wanted control," I said. He tilted his head slightly. "No," he replied. A pause. "I wanted understanding." That made more sense than anything else he had ever said. I exhaled slowly. "And did you get it?" Victor looked at me for a long moment. Then quietly, "Yes, not complete, not absolute, but enough." I nodded once, then turned toward the door. Halfway out, I stopped. Without turning back, I said, "If this happens again to someone else," I asked, "what would you do differently?" A pause. Victor's voice followed calmly. "Nothing," he said. A beat. "Because systems don't change behavior," he added. "They change interpretation." I didn't respond to that, because I understood it too well now. Outside, Boston looked the same as it always had. Busy, structured, unaware of the smaller systems operating inside it. But I didn't see it the same way anymore. I couldn't. Because once you've seen how easily structure shifts around visibility, you stop believing in permanence. Weeks later, things settled into something that resembled normal again. The hospital resumed its rhythm. My name returned to schedules. Patients came and went. Surgeries continued. Life resumed its shape, but not its illusion. Nora noticed the difference before I did. "You read quieter," she said one morning. I looked at her. "I'm the same," I replied. She shook her head slightly. "No," she said. "You read just more aware of how fragile normal is." I didn't argue, because she was right. And somewhere in that awareness, something else had changed too. I no longer confused stability with safety, or systems with certainty. One evening, as I was leaving the hospital, I paused at the exit, just for a moment, watching people move through their routines, unaware, unburdened by the structures they were already inside. And I realized something simple. Most people don't survive systems like this because they defeat them. They survive because they never realized they were inside one at all. I stepped outside into the cold air and kept walking. The narrative presented here is fictional and created for artistic expression. Names, characters, and incidents are either invented or used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to actual persons or events is unintended and should not be considered factual or deliberate.
In stories like this, it's easy to get distracted by the surface powerful men, hidden networks, and the quiet tension behind every conversation. But the real meaning of this story has very little to do with crime and everything to do with perception, responsibility, and the invisible structures that shape human life. At its core, this is a story about what happens when a person believes they are entering a situation on equal footing, only to discover they have been observed, measured, and understood long before they ever made a decision. The heroine thought she was simply dealing with a strained marriage and a distant family. In reality, she had stepped into a system that had already recorded her behavior, interpreted her choices, and adjusted around her presence. The moral lesson here is not about fear of power, it is about awareness of it. In real life, not all systems are visible. Some are emotional, some are institutional, and some are social. People often assume silence means safety, or that lack of confrontation means lack of consequence. But as this story shows, silence can also be a form of calculation. Being ignored does not always mean being dismissed. Sometimes it means being studied. Another important lesson is the difference between control and understanding. The mafia boss figure in this story is not simply a symbol of authority or intimidation. He represents a type of intelligence that prioritizes structure over emotion, observation over reaction, and long-term consequences over short-term satisfaction. Whether one agrees with his methods or not, the story forces us to reflect on how power operates when it is patient, disciplined, and systematic. At the same time, the heroine's journey reminds us that true strength is not about dominance, it is about clarity. She does not survive because she is the strongest in the room, but because she learns to see clearly, question deeply, and act with intention rather than fear. Her growth is not in defeating a system, but in understanding how it works and choosing how to respond within it. This is where the moral weight of the story truly lies. It challenges the audience to think beyond simple categories of good and evil and instead consider responsibility, awareness, and consequence. Every action exists within a larger structure, and every structure responds to pressure in ways we may not immediately see. Ultimately, this story teaches that real power is not loud. It does not announce itself. It observes, adapts, and waits. And the most important survival skill in any system, whether personal, professional, or emotional, is not control over others, but understanding the forces you are already part of. If this story made you reflect differently on power, silence, and human behavior, consider liking, commenting your thoughts, and subscribing for more narratives that reveal the hidden logic behind influence, authority, and the world most people never notice.